In the 1,970 seconds, he was the heartbeat of American grit. He was Popeye Doyle, a raw, unrelenting force of nature who didn't just play a role. He kicked down the screen and demanded your attention. He was the Iron Man of Hollywood, a two-time Oscar winner with $80 million in the bank and a reputation for being the toughest man in any room. But look at the man captured in a grainy, distant paparazzi photo at a gas station in 2023. Look at the sunken eyes, the emaciated frame, the solitary silhouette eating a cheap sandwich in the desert heat. How does a giant with a fortune end up losing a war with his own memory? Why did the most formidable presence in cinema vanish into the shadows long before the world was ready to let him go? For 2 decades, the public believed Gene Hackman was simply enjoying a well-earned retirement in the mountains of Santa Fe. We assumed silence meant peace. We were wrong. The true antagonist of his story wasn't a public scandal or a financial collapse. It was a single, devastating week in February 2025, a week where time stood still in a house worth millions. Reports suggest that while his wife lay silent in the next room, the man who once outwitted Lex Luthor sat in the dark, unable to remember the sequence of steps required to call for help. This is a story about the staggering price of privacy. It is an exploration of a man who built a fortress to escape the madness of fame, only to find that the walls eventually became his cage. Today we look past the awards and the legendary toughness to uncover the final, silent days of a legend who was forgotten while he was still breathing. This is the heartbreaking reality of Gene Hackman. The 26th of February 2025. Santa Fe, New Mexico. In a gated community where privacy is purchased at a premium, silence is the standard. The roads are pristine, the neighbors are polite, and no one asks questions. But when the mail began to pile up and the massive iron gates remained closed for days, local authorities were finally asked to perform a welfare check. They expected to find a retired icon resting in his chair. Instead, they walked into a scene of atmospheric neglect that would haunt the headlines for months. They found Gene Hackman, 95 years old, lying on the cold floor of the mudroom. It was a narrow, forgotten space near the back of the house, a place for boots, coats, and things you take off before entering the real home. He was still alive, but accounts from the scene described him as unrecognizable. The Iron Man was a shadow, his body showing the physical toll of what investigators later termed prolonged fasting. But the most devastating discovery was waiting in the master bedroom. Gene's wife of over 30 years, Betsy, had passed away a full week earlier. Reports indicate she had been taken quietly by a virus, a silent killer most people had never heard of that stopped her heart in a house too large and far too expensive for anyone to notice. In the end, there were no sirens. There was no final monologue delivered with thunder in the voice. There was only the collapse of self-governance. Because of the advanced stages of Alzheimer's, Gene could no longer interpret the reality of the woman lying still beside him. He didn't call for help, not because he chose not to, but because the disease had erased the meaning of the telephone, the urgency of the moment, and the concept of time itself. For 7 days, he moved through the house like a ghost. He sat in the silence next to the woman he loved, waiting for a cue that would never come. Even the couple's dog was found as a silent witness to the tragedy, trapped in its own dependency, because the man who once commanded entire movie sets could no longer remember how to release a latch. This was not a tragedy of excess. It wasn't drugs, debt, or disgrace. This was a man with a fortune nearing $80 million, reduced to absolute vulnerability by the intersection of time and biology. Money could buy the land, and money could buy the silence, but money could not buy the cognition required to survive. This was a bankruptcy of care in a palace of gold. But to understand how the Iron Man reached this mudroom floor, we have to go back. We have to look at the moment he first felt the walls of his life beginning to close in, not from the outside, but from within. Behind every tough guy, there is a breaking point that no amount of grit can overcome. For Gene Hackman, that point arrived in the sweltering summer of 1990. At 60 years old, he was at the absolute peak of his power. He was commanding millions per film, working with the intensity of a man half his age, and carrying the respect of a world that viewed him as indestructible. But while he was playing the Iron Man on screen, his own body was staging a quiet mutiny. Reports from that time suggest it was a diagnosis many men of his generation ignored until it was too late: atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. The very vessels that carried his life force were narrowing, clogging under the stress of a career built on high-voltage confrontation. One afternoon, the world stopped. The man who never backed down from a fight was rushed into emergency surgery for an angioplasty. This was the first appearance of the hidden antagonist. It wasn't a villain with a gun or a rival actor. It was his own mortality. In the quiet of the recovery room, the irony was brutal. A man famous for commanding every scene he entered was suddenly dependent on machines to command his own pulse. For the first time, Gene Hackman felt fragile. The warrior who wasn't afraid of anything was now haunted by the sound of his own heartbeat. This fear began to bleed into his soul, changing the way he looked at the world and his place in it. He began to realize that his internal compass, which had always pointed towards strength and dominance, was starting to misfire. This wasn't just a medical hurdle. It was a wake-up call that signaled the beginning of a slow, steady retreat. He started to wonder if the darkness he inhabited on screen was somehow feeding the darkness in his chest. In the late 1980 seconds, Gene Hackman held the keys to one of the most iconic roles in cinematic history. He had purchased the rights to a terrifying novel titled The Silence of the Lambs. He didn't just want to star in it, he planned to direct it. He envisioned himself at the center of the story as the ultimate monster, Hannibal Lecter. It should have been his masterpiece. His cold military precision and his ability to turn a whisper into a threat were perfectly suited for the most famous cannibal in fiction. But as he sat in his recovery chair in 1990, pale and shaken by his brush with death, the project took on a different light. Accounts suggest that his daughter, Elizabeth, read the script and recoiled. She didn't see a brilliant role. She saw a psychological toll that her father, in his weakened state, could no longer afford to pay. She saw the intimacy of the evil and the darkness of the character, and she begged him to let it go. She reportedly asked him to be her father, not the monster. For the first time in his professional life, the Iron Man surrendered. He sold the rights and watched from the outside as another actor took the role, the Oscar, and the immortality. This was more than a missed career opportunity. It was a psychological severing. By turning away from Lecter, Gene Hackman didn't just decline a role, he withdrew from the most coherent part of his creative identity. The roles that once served as anchors for his aggression were gone. What followed was a period of drift. He began taking safer characters, lighter tones, and comedies that never quite fit his granite features. He told interviewers he was tired of being the tough guy. But for a man like Gene, tired was the beginning of an erosion of self. By trying to save his heart, he began a process of self-erasure. He traded the intensity that defined him for a quiet life, unknowingly stepping away from the very structures that kept his mind sharp, engaged, and anchored to the world. In the shifting tides of the cruel voice of fate, money is the ultimate illusion. By the time Gene Hackman walked away from Hollywood in 2004, he had built a financial empire. He belonged to an era where stars were paid like kings. For the 1978 Superman, he received a paycheck of $2 million, a staggering sum at the time that solidified his status as a titan. By the end, his net worth was estimated at over $80 million. But here lies the financial paradox of his life. For most, $80 million represents the ultimate safety net, a guarantee of doctors on call, round-the-clock, caregivers, and layers of protection. In Gene's case, his wealth did something far more dangerous. It created a fortress of invisibility. He retreated to his desert compound in Santa Fe, buying the best security money could afford to keep the paparazzi and the fake friends of Hollywood at bay. He achieved the privacy he craved, but he didn't realize that in old age, privacy can easily morph into isolation. When the silence was finally broken in February 2025, investigators reportedly found evidence that shattered the cultural myth that success buys dignity in decline. Despite the millions in the bank, the man who could have bought 1,000 restaurants showed signs of what reports described as prolonged fasting. The cruelest detail wasn't a lack of resources, but a lack of infrastructure. In a house worth millions, the fridge was a testament to a fractured mind. He didn't refuse food accounts, suggest he simply forgot how to initiate the process of eating. Money could not buy him a memory. It couldn't translate the signal of hunger into the action of a meal. It couldn't alert the world that the man on the mountain of gold was starving in his own kitchen. For an audience watching from the outside, it is a chilling reminder. The greatest fear of aging isn't losing your fortune. It's losing the people who know your name and the systems that keep you tethered to life. The Iron Man was discovering that even a golden cage is still a cage. Time is a thief that doesn't just take your years. It takes your presence. For 50 years, Gene Hackman was a solid object. He was a Marine. He carried a thick neck, a heavy brow, and eyes that could burn through a brick wall. But in the final act, the Iron Man began to rust in plain sight. The physical toll became impossible to hide when paparazzi captured a rare glimpse of him at a gas station in 2023. The world gasped. This wasn't the formidable Lex Luthor or the relentless Popeye Doyle. Accounts described a skeleton at the pump, a man hunched and emaciated, his skin hanging loosely off a frame that once dominated the silver screen. His eyes, once so sharp and piercing, were reportedly clouded by the advancing fog of Alzheimer's. Under his clothes, his body was a map of the wars he had fought with time. He carried the long vertical scar from the 1,990 heart surgery, and in 2019, another mechanical resident was added, a pacemaker. There is a brutal irony in a man who lived with such raw, natural power being kept alive by a battery and a wire pulsing under his skin. The pacemaker kept the rhythm, but the man was no longer there to hear the beat. This physical decline was a disappearing. He was 95 pounds of memories and scar tissue, walking with a tremble that made onlookers turn away in a mix of respect and pity. The tragedy of his physical state was that he was losing the ability to tell anyone where it hurt. The lights inside the fortress were going out one by one, and because he had removed himself from every environment, film sets, gyms, studios designed to observe him closely, there was no one to notice the dimming. He was a giant who had shrunk into a child, standing alone in a house that kept his secrets perfectly. The 30th of October 2012. Santa Fe, New Mexico. The world had largely come to view Gene Hackman as a toothless tiger. He was 82 years old, a quiet retiree who spent his afternoons painting or riding his e-bike through the desert air. The fire of Popeye Doyle was supposed to be extinguished, replaced by the calm, rhythmic pace of a man who had left the battlefield long ago. But the cruelest trick of fate is that a Marine never truly forgets how to fight, even when his mind begins to forget why. According to reports at the time, Gene and his wife Betsy were leaving a restaurant when they were approached by a man. This wasn't a request for an autograph or a polite greeting. It was a confrontation. Witnesses described a scene where the man directed a foul, unprintable insult toward Betsy. In that split second, the decades of quiet retirement and the safe roles vanished. Gene Hackman didn't call for security. He didn't hide behind his wealth. He delivered a stinging, open-handed slap across the man's face. This was the specific scene that briefly returned the legend to the headlines. It was a total collapse of self-restraint, an outburst that some called unacceptable and others called heroic. But for those watching closely, it was something far deeper than rage. It was instinct. It was the last reflex of a man whose identity was built on protection, confrontation, and control. In that moment, the warrior stepped out of the shadows of fiction and into the daylight for one final roar. Yet, there was a haunting undertone to the event. Observers described him as shaken afterward, perhaps aware, if only for a moment, that his internal wiring was starting to misfire. This wasn't just a tough guy holding his ground. It was a man becoming increasingly reactive as the layers of social decorum began to peel away. The hidden antagonist of Alzheimer's often reveals itself in these flashes of raw, uncalculated impulse. After that afternoon, the world would never truly see him again. The gate to the compound closed for good, and the tiger went back into the dark, leaving only the silence to grow. To understand the heartbreak of a legend, you have to listen to the words they say when they realize they are disappearing. Gene Hackman's life was built on the craft of acting, but accounts suggest his soul was deeply weary of the machinery of fame. His forgotten quotes over the years serve as a map of his steady withdrawal from a world he no longer recognized. As far back as 1985, at the peak of his power, he told an interviewer that if you see yourself as a star, you've already lost something in the portrayal of a human being. He didn't want the pedestal. He wanted the truth. But by 2004, in his final major interview, the exhaustion was palpable. He admitted that he wasn't trained to be a celebrity. He was trained to play roles, and he found the world of lawyers, agents, and the press to be a den of snakes he no longer had the stomach to navigate. But the most haunting admission came in 2011. While reflecting on his career and looking at clips of his old films, Gene whispered that it was painful to watch himself on screen. He said he saw an old man with a sagging chin and tired eyes, and most tellingly, he confessed, "I don't recognize that man anymore." Think about the weight of that realization. To the world, he was a monument of grit and authority, but to himself, he was becoming a stranger. This was more than just the vanity of an aging actor. It was derealization. It was the beginning of a fracture between his internal identity and the reflection in the mirror, a betrayal of memory that arrived years before the official diagnosis. He was mourning his own passing while still sitting in his chair. He had built a fortress to protect his privacy, but he ended up being locked in a room with a man he no longer knew. By the time the silence of the Santa Fe compound became absolute, Gene Hackman had already said everything we needed to hear about why no one would be invited inside to witness the end. He had spent his life running from the falsehood of stardom, only to find that without the light of the world to anchor him, the darkness of the self was becoming total. Every fortress, no matter how imposing, has a hidden flaw. For Gene Hackman, the flaw in his golden cage wasn't a broken lock or a failed security system. It was the very silence he had worked so hard to achieve. On the 26th of February 2025, that silence was finally broken by the sound of heavy boots on tile. When the police entered the mudroom of that luxury estate, they weren't just discovering a body. They were uncovering the atmospheric failure of total isolation. The investigation into those final days revealed a timeline that is as baffling as it is heartbreaking. Reports suggest that Gene's wife, Betsy, had been the singular force keeping the world at bay. She was his gatekeeper, his memory, and his hands. But the Southwest desert hides a hidden antagonist in its dust, the hantavirus. It is a rare, terrifying illness carried by rodents, striking with a speed that leaves no room for negotiation. Accounts indicate that Betsy had fallen ill and passed away in a matter of days, leaving the house in a state of sudden, absolute stillness. Because Gene was in the late, fragmented stages of Alzheimer's, he couldn't process the finality of the stillness. For 7 long, agonizing days, the man who once filled movie screens with absolute authority lived in a bankruptcy of care. He didn't know he was hungry. He didn't know he was thirsty. He sat by his wife's side, waiting for a voice that would never speak again. The kitchen didn't demand meals, and the phone didn't ring, and the house offered no cues strong enough to force awareness. Even the dog, trapped in its own dependency, became part of the terrible calm. When authorities finally found him emaciated on that mudroom floor, he was a shadow of the man who once dominated the silver screen. The autopsy from April 2025 would label it natural causes, but the deeper truth is that Gene Hackman died of privacy. He had been so successful at hiding from the world that when he finally needed the world to find him, the walls he built were too high to climb. This wasn't a death born of violence. It was a death born of unfinished processes. The house didn't kill him. It simply didn't notice he was fading. In the stories we tell ourselves, endings are supposed to offer closure. They are meant to reward our attention with a final monologue or a standing ovation. But the end of Gene Hackman offers something quieter and far more uncomfortable. It is a mirror for a generation that grew up with his grit. He taught us about honor and the raw, unvarnished truth of the American soul, yet his final act is a warning about the fragility of autonomy. Gene Hackman's ending is not a cautionary tale about the pitfalls of fame. It is a story about the danger of independence taken to its extreme. He spent his life running from the star label, only to find that without the connection to the world that stardom provides, the darkness is absolute. He was a Marine who held his ground until the very end, But he discovered that you can buy a fence, but you cannot buy a friend. You can have $80 million in the bank and still find yourself alone in a house of gold, waiting for a memory that will never return. The desert wind now sweeps across that Santa Fe compound, and the silence he built finally belongs to him. The Iron Man is at rest. But as we close the file on this legend of the sand, we find that the cruel voice of fate is already turning its gaze toward another icon, one whose fall from grace was far more violent and far louder than the quiet retreat of Gene Hackman. In the same years that Gene was winning his second Oscar, another man was the highest-paid actor on television. He was the pilot of the sky, a 1,980 seconds heartthrob, with a smile that defined an era of high-octane adventure. But unlike Gene, this man's hidden antagonist wasn't a quiet house or a fading memory. It was a self-destructive fire that burned through 3 decades of fame. The tabloids of the time showed the yachts and the parties, but they didn't show the physical toll of a body being hacked apart by its own habits. This was a man who went from the cockpit of a multi-million-dollar helicopter to a hospital bed where he woke up to find his own leg was missing. He spent his final days living in a trailer, a ghost of the man who was once the king of the clouds, haunted by a $20,000 medical bill he couldn't pay. You think you know why the Airwolf crashed? You think you know the tragedy of the man who had the world at his feet, only to lose the feet themselves? The story of John Michael Vincent is a crash that never truly ended, and it is waiting for you now.